A guitar riff nobody could write words for 2 straight years. A record label that begged the band to cut it down. And a joke shouted at concerts that eventually became a genuine tribute to the men who wrote it. Welcome to Music Chronicle. Chapter 1.
Would you still remember me?
7 years in bar. Bands long before Freebird existed, there was just a group of teenagers in Jacksonville, Florida, playing music together because they didn't have much else to do. Ronnie Van Zant, guitarists Gary Rossington and Alan Collins, bassist Larry Junstrom, and drummer Bob Burns started jamming together in 1964, cycling through a handful of forgettable band names over the following years. The name that finally stuck arrived as an inside joke. Leonard Skinner, a gym teacher at their old high school, had a well-known habit of sending boys home for having hair too long by his standards. The band immortalized him, with the spelling deliberately scrambled, as Lynyrd Skynyrd. What followed was nearly a decade of unglamorous work, grinding through clubs and bars across the South, refining their sound one show at a time. Guitarist Gary Rossington later described those years plainly. The band had already written most of its signature songs long before anyone outside Jacksonville had ever heard of them, simply because they'd had so much time on the road to work everything out. The lineup shifted repeatedly during those years, too. Members leaving to join other groups, new players coming in, roadies eventually stepping up to become full band members themselves, all while Van Zant, Rossington, and Collins remained the constant core, holding everything together. It took a chance encounter to finally get them in front of a record label. Producer Al Kooper, best known at the time for his work with Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones, had just convinced MCA Records to bankroll a new imprint built around Southern talent, hoping to compete directly with the label already home to the Allman Brothers Band. Cooper caught a Lynyrd Skynyrd show, recognized immediately that the band's live set was something special enough to build a whole roster around, and signed them. That signing story even made its way into one of the band's own songs, a wry, half-grateful, half-suspicious account of a Southern band sizing up a well-dressed record executive from out of town, ultimately deciding the deal was worth taking, despite their reservations. By 1973, 7 years after those first teenage jam sessions, Lynyrd Skynyrd finally had a debut album ready for release. Buried at the very end of the tracklist was the song that had taken longer to finish than almost anything else the band had written. Chapter 2.
I must be traveling on now.
A riff-looking for words guitarist Alan Collins had been carrying the musical foundation of Freebird around for years before it became a finished song. He'd worked out the chord progression sometime around 1970, and by his own account, and Rossington's, kept bringing it back to Ronnie Van Zant, hoping the singer would finally write something to go with it. Van Zant, the band's primary lyricist, kept turning him down. According to Rossington, Van Zant found the chord changes simply too dense and constantly shifting to write a melody or lyric against, and for roughly 2 years, that was the end of the conversation every time Collins brought it up. Collins and Rossington kept quietly practicing the music anyway, refusing to let the idea die completely, even without Van Zant's buy-in. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived almost by accident, and from an unexpected source. Collins's girlfriend at the time, Kathy Johns, asked him a simple, pointed question during an argument between the two of them, essentially asking whether he'd still remember her if he left. Struck by how directly she'd put it, Collins wrote the line down. When Van Zant eventually heard it, something clicked that hadn't clicked before. He asked Collins to run through the chords again, and again after that, gradually working out a melody while lying on a couch, until the words that would open the finished song finally arrived. A riff that had sat unfinished for 2 full years suddenly had exactly the lyric it needed, borrowed almost word for word from a real conversation that had nothing to do with music at all. Chapter 3. From Ballad to Epic. The earliest documented version of Freebird, recorded by the band in 1972, before they'd even signed with MCA, was a comparatively modest, largely acoustic ballad, built around Van Zant's vocal and Collins's chord progression, with nothing resembling the extended instrumental ending fans would eventually come to expect. That version might easily have been the final one if the band hadn't kept playing the song live and discovering, night after night, just how far they could stretch it. By the time Lynyrd Skynyrd entered Studio One in Doraville, Georgia, in April 1973, to record their debut album with Al Kooper producing, the band had grown to include 3 guitarists at once: Alan Collins, Gary Rossington, and newer addition Ed King, who'd originally joined as the band's bassist before switching over to guitar. Once original bassist Leon Wilkeson briefly stepped away from the group. Having 3 guitar players in the same lineup gave Lynyrd Skynyrd a genuinely rare musical toolkit: the ability to layer parts, trade lines, and build toward a climax with far more instrumental depth than most rock bands of the era could manage. The transformation from ballad to epic didn't happen in the studio at all. It happened gradually, on stage, over the many months between that first stripped-down 1972 recording and the album version fans would eventually know. Playing the song night after night in front of live audiences, the band kept finding new places to extend it, new instrumental ideas worth trying out, and by the time they were ready to commit a final version to tape, the song had grown organically into something far more ambitious than anyone had originally set out to write. The album version that resulted ran just over 9 minutes, roughly 4.5 of which belonged to the vocal, folk-tinged first half of the song, and the rest belonging to something else entirely: an extended, escalating instrumental passage that had almost nothing to do with the tender ballad it grew out of. Chapter 4: The Guitar Solo That Ate the Song. Those final 4 minutes of Free Bird have become one of the most celebrated extended instrumental passages in rock history. 3 guitars trading and layering lines that build steadily from a slow, almost mournful tone into a full tilt, driving climax. The style owes an obvious debt to the twin guitar interplay the Allman Brothers Band had pioneered a few years earlier, a connection Rossington and Collins have both acknowledged directly, having grown up admiring exactly that kind of extended Southern rock guitar work. When MCA prepared to release Free Bird as a single in late 1974, the label pushed hard for the band to trim the ending down to something closer to standard radio length, arguing correctly that most stations simply wouldn't play a 9-minute rock song in full. The band agreed to a shortened single edit, cutting the track down to around 4.5 minutes for commercial release, but refused to let that edited version replace the album cut in the band's own live shows, or in how the song was generally understood. A radio edit trimming the entire instrumental coda down to roughly a single minute technically exists in the archives. By virtually every account, it's a version almost nobody, on the radio or anywhere else, has ever actually chosen to play. Chapter 5: The Duane Allman Myth. For decades, a persistent rumor has followed Free Bird everywhere it goes, that the song, and especially its extended guitar coda, was written as a direct tribute to Duane Allman, the Allman Brothers Band's celebrated guitarist, who died in a motorcycle accident in October 1971. The timeline makes that literally impossible. Alan Collins had already been working on the song's music for roughly a year before Allman's death, and the finished track wasn't released until 1973, nearly 2 years after the fact. Ronnie Van Zant's lyrics, about a man unable to commit to settling down with the woman he loves, have nothing to do with Allman's life or death either. The confusion largely traces back to the instrumental ending itself, played in a style so clearly inspired by the twin guitar tradition Allman himself had helped popularize that listeners simply assumed the connection had to be intentional and personal. What is true, and what likely helped the myth take root in the first place, is that the band did frequently dedicate the song to Allman during live performances, alongside Allman Brothers bassist Barry Oakley, who died in a strikingly similar motorcycle accident almost exactly 1 year after Allman, on a street just a few blocks from where Allman himself had crashed. During a 1975 television performance, Van Zant dedicated the song to both musicians directly, calling them, in his own words, free birds themselves. The song wasn't written for Allman, but by the mid-1970s, the band had effectively adopted it as one anyway, turning a song about a fictional restless drifter into a genuine recurring tribute to 2 friends and influences the band had lost far too young. Chapter 6: Release and a Slow Climb. Free Bird wasn't released as a single until November 1974, more than a year after the album containing it had already come out, once the song had built enough of a reputation through live shows and word of mouth that MCA finally saw commercial potential in pushing it as its own release. The single edit reached number 19 on the Billboard Hot 100 in early 1975, a solid result, though notably lower than some of the band's more concise, radio-friendly songs would achieve in the years that followed. Chart position, though, was never really the point. The song's real life happened on stage. On the band's 1976 live album One More from the Road, a recording captures Van Zandt simply asking the crowd what song they wanted to hear, and the overwhelming, unmistakable response leads directly into a version of Free Bird stretched out to nearly 14 minutes. That's the shape the song took on as Lynyrd Skynyrd's live reputation grew through the mid-1970s. Not a tightly contained studio single, but a nightly showcase, closing the set, that could run as long as the band's own energy and the crowd's reaction allowed it to. Chapter 7. The Night Everything Changed. On October 20th, 1977, just 3 days after finishing work on their fifth album, Street Survivors, Lynyrd Skynyrd boarded a chartered plane heading from Greenville, South Carolina, to a scheduled show in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The plane, an aging twin-engine Convair the band had chartered for the tour, ran out of fuel and crashed into a wooded, swampy area near Gillsburg, Mississippi, tearing through trees before coming to rest in the mud. Ronnie Van Zant was killed instantly, along with guitarist Steve Gaines, backup vocalist Cassie Gaines, assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick, and both pilots. Alan Collins and Gary Rossington survived, both seriously injured. The rest of the band and touring crew survived as well, many with severe, lasting injuries of their own, some requiring months of recovery. MCA immediately withdrew the album's original cover artwork, which had depicted the band standing amid flames, a piece of imagery that had felt appropriately dramatic days earlier and became unbearable to look at almost overnight. Just before the crash, according to drummer Artemis Pyle, Van Zant had told him during a conversation on tour that he genuinely believed he wouldn't live to see 30, and that whatever happened to him, it would happen on the road. He was 29 years old when he died, the tragedy arriving just as the band, 7 years into a hard-won career, had finally reached the commercial peak they'd spent their whole youth chasing. Chapter 8. Silence, then Return. Lynyrd Skynyrd effectively ceased to exist for the next decade. The surviving members largely stepped away from performing as a band for several years, reuniting only once during that stretch, for a single instrumental performance of Free Bird at Charlie Daniels' Volunteer Jam in Nashville in 1979, a tribute rather than any kind of relaunch. Rossington, Collins, keyboardist Billy Powell, and bassist Leon Wilkeson eventually regrouped as the Rossington-Collins Band in 1980, and out of respect for Van Zant, they too performed Free Bird only as an instrumental, with a new female vocalist fronting the rest of the group's material, but deliberately stepping aside for that one song each night. Tragedy struck the band again before any reunion could happen. In 1986, Alan Collins was involved in a serious car accident that killed his girlfriend and left him paralyzed from the chest down. He never played guitar again, though he would later serve as a musical director for the reunited band, unable to perform, but still deeply involved in shaping how the music sounded. In 1987, a full decade after the crash, Rossington and the surviving original members organized a proper reunion tour, bringing in Ronnie's younger brother, Johnny Van Zant, as the new lead singer. Johnny has said plainly that stepping into that role, singing his own brother's words to audiences who remembered the original, night after night, wasn't something he'd ever wanted or expected to do. For that entire 1987 tribute tour, the band still performed Free Bird as an instrumental only, unwilling to have anyone, even Ronnie's own brother, sing those specific words yet. Johnny Van Zant didn't sing Free Bird with the band for the first time until the band's 1991 tour reached its stop in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was the exact city the original lineup had been flying toward on the night of the crash, 14 years earlier, when they never arrived. Chapter 9. Why Everyone Shouts Free Bird. At some point in the late 1970s, shouting Free Bird at a concert, any concert, regardless of the performer or genre on stage, became a running joke shared across the entire music world. The tradition didn't start with this specific song. Similar shouted requests had already attached themselves to the Allman Brothers' Whipping Post and to Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water earlier in the decade. But by around 1979, Free Bird had become the dominant version of the joke, helped along, according to some accounts, by a Chicago radio host named Kevin Matthews, who kept the bit alive and popular on his own show through the 1980s. The gag proved durable enough to survive into an entirely different musical era. During Nirvana's famous 1993 MTV Unplugged performance, someone in the crowd shouted the request, and the band, rather than ignoring it, briefly obliged with a loose, half-joking snippet of a completely different Southern rock classic instead. Decades later, the shout has become such a permanent fixture of live music culture that most people who yell it at a show have likely never sat through the actual 9-minute studio recording in full. It's less a request at this point than a piece of shared performance ritual, a wink between strangers in a crowd who all recognize the reference regardless of what's actually playing on stage. Chapter 10. Where it sits today. Decades after its release, Free Bird remains a fixture of nearly every serious accounting of rock's greatest recordings. Rolling Stone placed it inside its list of the 500 greatest songs of all time, and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame included it among the 500 songs it considers to have shaped the genre. Guitar-focused publications have repeatedly ranked its extended instrumental coda among the greatest recorded guitar performances in rock history, a direct product of exactly the three-guitar interplay the band had built up through years of live performance before ever formally recording it. The band itself has kept the song at the emotional center of its live shows for essentially its entire existence, before and after the tragedy that nearly ended it. Guitarist Gary Rossington, reflecting on the song decades later, noted how differently it comes to mean something to each new listener, describing hearing from fans who'd used it at graduations and, just as often, at funerals, a love song that had somehow become adaptable enough to mark both the happiest and the most painful moments in people's lives. That flexibility has also made the song a genuinely rare commercial survivor. It continues to sell and stream in numbers most 50-year-old album tracks never come close to matching, still finding its way onto classic rock radio, wedding playlists, and film soundtracks looking for an instantly recognizable shorthand for freedom, loss, or both at once. For a song that took 2 full years to find its opening line, that kind of open-ended emotional resonance has turned out to be exactly what's kept it alive for more than half a century. Chapter 11. The Legacy. Free Bird started as a chord progression Alan Collins couldn't get anyone to take seriously, sat unfinished for 2 years, and was eventually completed thanks to a single honest question asked during an argument that had nothing to do with songwriting at all. It grew, night after night in bars and clubs across the South, from a modest acoustic ballad into a 9-minute instrumental showcase built by 3 guitarists who'd spent years learning to play off each other before a record label ever paid attention. Then, in October 1977, the song became something none of its writers could have anticipated. A eulogy the band would have to keep performing, in one form or another, for the rest of its existence. First as a wordless instrumental too painful to sing, then, 14 years later, and in the exact city the doomed flight had been heading toward, as a song sung once again, this time by the brother of the man who wrote it. Somewhere along the way, it also became a joke, shouted by strangers at concerts who've never really listened to it, and somehow that never diminished what the song actually means to the people who lived through writing it, playing it, and losing bandmates because of it. Few songs in rock history carry quite that combination, genuine grief and a running gag, existing side by side, decade after decade, both perfectly intact. If this pulled you into the story, that's exactly what Music Chronicle is here for. Subscribe, and join us next time as we open the door on another song that changed everything.